Picture a man who spent 6 years fighting on the Eastern Front, the single deadliest theater of the Second World War. A man who was wounded so many times his medical file read like a catalog of ways the human body can be broken and put back together. A man who earned every major military decoration Nazi Germany could bestow: the Knight's Cross, the oak leaves, the swords, honors reserved for a vanishingly small number of commanders who performed at a level most officers never approached. He survived encirclements that swallowed entire armies. He walked away from battles that killed tens of thousands around him. And when Germany finally collapsed in May 1945, Helmut Becker was still alive. Then 7 years later, long after the guns had gone silent, long after the rubble had been cleared and the world had started pretending it had moved on, he was pulled from a Soviet prison cell, marched into a courtyard, and shot. No battlefield, no enemy, no last stand, just a tribunal that had already made up its mind, and a bullet that arrived years after the war was supposed to be over. He wasn't executed because he lost. He wasn't executed because he broke under pressure or failed his command. He was executed because the Soviet system needed names. And Helmut Becker's name was on a list in a filing cabinet in a country that had every reason to want someone to answer for what had happened on the Eastern Front. He was one of the most heavily decorated SS generals in the entire Third Reich. He survived everything the war threw at him. And in the end, it was a quiet morning in a prison courtyard that finished what 6 years of combat could not. His name was Helmut Becker, and this is his story. Helmut Becker was born in 1902 in Hesse, in central Germany, into the kind of unremarkable working-class background that produced not generals and strategists, but laborers and tradesmen. There was no military dynasty behind him, no Prussian officer tradition, no family seat with swords mounted above the fireplace. He was simply a young German man trying to find his footing in a country that had none to offer. Germany after the First World War was not a place that rewarded patience. The economy had been gutted. The political system lurched between factions that despised one another. And for young men like Becker, men without wealth, connections, or obvious futures, the promises made by movements like National Socialism carried a weight that is difficult to appreciate from the outside, but impossible to ignore if you were living through it. Purpose, belonging, direction. A uniform and a cause in a country that seemed to have lost both. When Becker joined the SS in the early 1930s, he was doing what hundreds of thousands of men his age were doing. Not because they were uniquely evil, but because they were uniquely adrift, and the SS offered structure in a world that had dissolved into chaos. He rose through the ranks steadily, building the kind of quiet professional reputation that earns an officer responsibility before it earns him recognition. By the time war broke out in September 1939, Becker was already an experienced SS officer, and he was attached to one of the most infamous formations in the entire German military, the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf. The name translates as Death's Head, and it was not chosen lightly. The Totenkopf Division had been built from the personnel of the SS concentration camp guard system, which meant that the men who formed its core brought with them something far darker than ordinary military discipline. They carried a set of assumptions about human life and acceptable conduct that separated them from even the other Waffen-SS divisions. And those assumptions produced atrocities from the very first weeks of the war. In France in 1940, soldiers from the Totenkopf lined up nearly 100 British prisoners of war at a farmstead called Le Paradis and executed them, who were then moved among the bodies with bayonets to confirm the job was done. That single incident tells you most of what you need to understand about the culture of the organization Helmut Becker had chosen to build his career inside. But on the battlefield itself, separated from the crimes committed behind the lines, the Totenkopf was one of the most devastatingly effective fighting formations Germany possessed. And Becker was one of the reasons it stayed that way. He was the kind of frontline commander the Waffen-SS prized above all others, calm under fire, decisive in collapse, and willing to lead from positions where the likelihood of survival was a secondary concern, because the man Helmut Becker became on the Eastern Front did not appear from nowhere. He was built, slowly and deliberately, by a country that was itself coming apart at the seams. To understand Becker, you first have to understand the Germany he grew up in. And the Germany of the 1920s was not a country in any stable sense of the word. It was a wound. The First World War had ended in 1918 with a defeat that most Germans never fully accepted. The Treaty of Versailles stripped the nation of territory, military capacity, and, perhaps most dangerously, dignity. Reparations crippled the economy. Inflation reached levels so absurd that people carried wheelbarrows of banknotes to buy bread. And by the time the currency stabilized, the savings of an entire generation had been wiped out overnight. The political system offered no anchor either. The Weimar Republic lurched from crisis to crisis. Assassinations, attempted coups, street violence between communist and nationalist factions that turned cities into low-grade battlegrounds. For ordinary Germans, the message was unmistakable. The old world had been destroyed, and nothing reliable had replaced it. This was the world Helmut Becker came of age in, not the Germany of poets and philosophers that Europeans like to romanticize, but the Germany of breadlines, bitterness, and broken institutions. A place where young men without money or connections had no clear path forward, and where anyone offering certainty was guaranteed an audience. And no one offered certainty quite like the National Socialist movement. By the early 1930s, Adolf Hitler's party had transformed from a fringe group into a political force that spoke directly to the frustrations of men like Becker. It promised restoration, order, national pride rebuilt from the ground up. And for those willing to commit fully, it offered something even more immediate: a role, a rank, and a uniform. Becker joined the SS during this period, and the decision was not unusual. Hundreds of thousands made the same choice. What set him apart was what came after. He did not simply join, he excelled. He demonstrated the kind of disciplined, methodical competence that any military organization rewards. And he rose through the ranks with a steadiness that suggested genuine ability rather than mere ideological enthusiasm. His superiors noticed. In the rigid hierarchy of the SS, talent without loyalty was dangerous, and loyalty without talent was useless. Becker appeared to possess both, and that combination opened doors. But those doors led somewhere specific. If the SS was not merely a military organization, it was the ideological core of Hitler's state, built on racial doctrine, absolute obedience, and a willingness to operate beyond the boundaries that constrained conventional forces. Every promotion Becker accepted, every assignment he fulfilled, drew him deeper into a system whose true nature was becoming harder to ignore with each passing year. Whether he saw it clearly at the time is unknowable. What is certain is that by the time war arrived, Helmut Becker was no longer simply a soldier looking for direction. He was exactly where the regime wanted him, and exactly where the road ahead would demand the most from him. The unit Helmut Becker had attached his career to was not just another division in the German military, it was something else entirely. When the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, Death's Head, carried its reputation in its name, and that name was earned long before the division ever saw a battlefield. Unlike conventional Wehrmacht formations, the Totenkopf was not built from regular army personnel or peacetime conscripts. It was constructed from the men who had staffed the SES concentration camp system, guards who had spent years overseeing the imprisonment, forced labor, and systematic abuse of civilians deemed enemies of the state. These were men who had already been conditioned to view certain categories of human beings as something less than human, And when they were reorganized into a frontline fighting force, they brought that conditioning with them. The division's commander, Theodor Eicke, had designed the concentration camp system himself, but he was not a man troubled by moral restraint, and the formation he built reflected that. From its earliest days, the Totenkopf operated with a brutality that distinguished it even within the Waffen-SS, an organization that was itself no stranger to excess. The proof came almost immediately. In May 1940, during the invasion of France, soldiers of the Totenkopf Division captured approximately 97 British prisoners of war near a farmstead called Le Paradis. What followed was not the confusion of battle or the chaos of a collapsing front. It was deliberate. The prisoners were lined up against a barn wall and machine-gunned. Afterwards, men moved through the bodies with bayonets, ensuring no one survived. 2 men did survive, hidden beneath the dead, and their testimony would eventually bring the massacre to light. But at the time, the incident passed with little consequence for the unit. Within the culture of the Totenkopf, Le Paradis was not an aberration. It was an expression of the organization's fundamental character. And yet, this is the contradiction that runs through the entire story. On the battlefield itself, the Totenkopf was extraordinarily effective. Its soldiers fought with a ferocity and cohesion that made the division one of the most feared formations in the German order of battle. Commanders valued it precisely because it would hold positions that other units abandoned, advance into situations that other divisions avoided, and sustain casualties that would have broken less fanatical formations. It was inside this world that Helmut Becker was rising. He had proven himself competent, steady, and willing to lead from forward positions where survival was not guaranteed. His superiors trusted him with increasing responsibility, and within the rigid hierarchy of the SS mess, that trust translated into authority. But authority within the Totenkopf meant something specific. It meant commanding men whose institutional origins lay in the camp system. It meant operating within a formation whose relationship with the laws of war was, at best, selective. Becker was building a career inside a machine that produced both military results and human suffering, often simultaneously. And the Eastern Front, where that machine would be tested to its absolute limit, was about to begin. On the 22nd of June, 1941, everything changed. Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, and in doing so, to open a front that would consume more human life than any single military campaign in recorded history. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed the border that morning, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces, in an offensive so vast that it stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Nothing like it had ever been attempted, and nothing, not the planning, not the early victories, not the sheer confidence of the German High Command, could have prepared the men involved for what they were walking into. The Eastern Front was not simply a theater of war. It was a world unto itself. The distances alone were staggering. Supply lines that stretched hundreds of kilometers across terrain that ranged from dense forest to open steppe. With roads that turned to mud in autumn and froze into impassable sheets of ice in winter. The climate was an enemy in its own right. Temperatures plunged so far below zero that engines seized, weapons jammed, and men who fell asleep in exposed positions did not wake up. And then there was the Soviet resistance. The Red Army did not collapse the way German strategists had predicted. It absorbed catastrophic losses, entire armies encircled and destroyed, and kept fighting. Fresh divisions appeared where intelligence had reported none. The further the Germans advanced, the more the war began to resemble something no one had planned for. Not a campaign of rapid conquest, but a grinding, attritional nightmare with no clear end. It was into this environment that the Totenkopf Division was deployed. And it was in this environment that Helmut Becker began to distinguish himself in ways that would define the rest of his life. He led from the front, not as a gesture, but as a habit. While many officers of equivalent rank commanded from positions behind the immediate fighting, Becker placed himself where the danger was greatest. He moved with his forward units, made decisions under direct fire, and demonstrated a composure under pressure that earned him a particular kind of respect, the kind that cannot be manufactured and cannot be faked. He was wounded, and then wounded again. Each time he recovered and returned to command, often faster than medical advice would have suggested. His willingness to absorb punishment and keep functioning became part of his reputation. A man the front could damage but apparently not destroy. However, around him, the war was reshaping everyone it touched. Men who had arrived in the summer of 1941 with confidence and momentum were, within months, fighting simply to survive. The Eastern Front stripped away everything that was not essential: comfort, certainty, optimism, and replaced it with a single, relentless question: will I be alive tomorrow? For Helmut Becker, survival was not just an outcome. It was becoming an identity, and the war was only beginning. By 1943, the Eastern Front had become a place where survival was measured not in years, but in weeks. And the battles that defined that year should have killed Helmut Becker several times over. Stalingrad had already broken the myth of German invincibility. The destruction of the Sixth Army, an entire field army encircled, starved, as enforced to surrender, sent shock waves through the German military that no amount of propaganda could disguise. The strategic initiative was slipping, and every officer on the Eastern Front understood what that meant. The war was no longer about advancing. It was about holding on. The Totenkopf Division was thrown into the aftermath. As Soviet forces pushed westward following the Stalingrad disaster, units like Becker's were tasked with stabilizing lines that were collapsing faster than orders could account for. It was desperate, brutal work. Defensive actions fought across frozen ground against an enemy that now possessed both momentum and numerical superiority. Becker commanded in the middle of it, not from a headquarters, not through radio dispatches, but physically present at the points where the fighting was most intense. His leadership style had not changed. He still led from the front, still exposed himself to the same risks as the men under him. But the nature of the fighting had. This was no longer the rapid offensive warfare of 1941. This was attrition, grinding, exhausting, and merciless. Then came Kursk. In July 1943, Germany launched its last major offensive on the Eastern Front, a massive armored assault intended to pinch off a Soviet salient and recapture the initiative. What followed was the largest tank battle in history, involving thousands of armored vehicles across a front that erupted into chaos on a scale difficult to comprehend. The Totenkopf was in the thick of it, and Becker was in the thick of the Totenkopf. He was wounded again during the fighting. The exact number of injuries he sustained across the war varies by source, but by this point, his medical record had become something approaching absurd. Each time he went down, the expectation was reasonable that he would not return, and each time he did. Among the men who served under him, this pattern became something close to legend. Officers who survived what Becker survived were rare. Officers who survived it and came back to command repeatedly were almost unheard of. The decorations reflected this. Becker received the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest battlefield honor, followed by the oak leaves and eventually the swords. These were not awards handed out for participation. They were reserved for a minute number of commanders who had demonstrated sustained, exceptional performance under the most extreme conditions the war could produce. By the midpoint of the war, Helmut Becker had become something unusual, a man the Eastern Front apparently could not kill. But the war was not where his story would end, and the forces that would eventually finish what the battlefield could not were already in motion. After Kursk, there were no more grand offensives, only retreat. The war that had begun with lightning advances and triumphant encirclements had reversed entirely. Soviet forces, now vastly superior in numbers, material, and momentum, pushed westward with a relentlessness that the German military could slow but no longer stop. What had once been a war of conquest became a war of survival, fought across the same ground that German armies had crossed years earlier in the opposite direction. For commanders like Becker, the nature of leadership changed fundamentally, and the skills that mattered now were not the skills of attack, they were the skills of managed collapse, holding positions long enough for other units to withdraw, organizing defensive lines from forces that were exhausted, under strength, and running short of everything, making decisions not about how to win, but about how to lose as slowly as possible. And Becker adapted. Whatever else can be said about him, his tactical competence during the German retreat was remarkable. He demonstrated an ability to read deteriorating situations quickly, to extract his forces from positions that were becoming untenable, and to maintain unit cohesion under conditions that were dissolving formations all around him. While other divisions disintegrated, officers abandoning commands, soldiers surrendering in droves, entire units ceasing to function, Becker's command held together. But holding together did not change the outcome. It only delayed it. By early 1945, the Reich was collapsing from every direction. The Western Allies had crossed into Germany from France. The Soviets were closing on Berlin from the east. Cities were being reduced to rubble. The infrastructure that had sustained the German war machine, the railways, the fuel depots, the communications networks, was being systematically destroyed. Orders arrived that bore no relationship to reality. Units were instructed to hold positions with forces that no longer existed. Germany in its final months was not a functioning state. It was a machine tearing itself apart. And then, in May 1945, it was over. Helmut Becker did not die in a final stand. There was no dramatic last battle, no cinematic last charge against overwhelming odds. The end came as it came for thousands of German officers, with capture. Soviet forces took him prisoner, and in that single moment, everything that had defined his life for the previous 6 years was stripped away. He was no longer a commander. He had no division, no authority, no battlefield on which his skills had any value. He was a prisoner, one name among thousands in a system that did not distinguish between the decorated and the anonymous, between the competent and the mediocre. The Soviets had their own priorities, their own calculations, and individual military reputations meant nothing inside them. For the first time in his adult life, Helmut Becker's survival depended not on courage, skill, or tactical brilliance. It depended on something far less predictable and far less forgiving. The battlefield had rules Helmut Becker understood. The prison system had none, at least none that served the prisoner. After his capture in 1945, Becker entered a network of Soviet detention facilities that bore no resemblance to anything in his experience. There were no front lines to read, no tactical decisions to make, no subordinates to command. The skills that had kept him alive for 6 years on the Eastern Front were suddenly completely irrelevant. What replaced them was something far worse than combat: uncertainty. Soviet prison camps operated on a logic that was deliberately opaque to the men held inside them. Information was controlled. Timelines were non-existent. Prisoners were moved between facilities without explanation, held for periods that stretched from weeks into months and from months into years, with no indication of what was coming next, or whether anything was coming at all. The conditions were brutal in their own way, not the explosive violence of the front, but a slower, more corrosive kind of suffering. Inadequate food, bitter cold, illness that spread through overcrowded facilities with no meaningful medical response, and above all, the psychological weight of captivity, the knowledge that your life was no longer your own, that every day continued only because someone elsewhere had not yet decided otherwise. For a man like Becker, a man who had spent years making decisions under fire, exercising authority, controlling outcomes, this was a particular kind of torment. The battlefield had been terrifying, but it had also been comprehensible. When you acted and consequences followed. In the Soviet prison system, action was irrelevant. You waited, and you endured, and you hoped that whatever process was grinding away behind closed doors would not eventually grind its way to you. Around him, the world was moving on. Germany had been divided. The Cold War was taking shape. New alliances were being formed, and old enemies were being quietly rehabilitated or quietly disposed of, depending on political calculations that had nothing to do with guilt or innocence and everything to do with utility. Because that was the reality of the Soviet approach to German prisoners of war. They were not simply captives, they were assets, to be used, leveraged, or discarded according to the needs of the moment. Some were released relatively quickly, others were put to forced labor, and others were held in reserve, their fates suspended indefinitely, kept alive not out of mercy, but because they might yet serve a purpose. Becker was among the latter. Year after year, he remained in captivity. 1946 passed, then 1947, then 1948. The war receded further into history, and still he sat in a Soviet facility, alive but unresolved. A man whose file had not yet been closed. He survived. Not through the qualities that had defined him on the Eastern Front, not through courage or tactical brilliance or physical resilience, but through the only thing left available to him, the capacity to endure without knowing why. And then in 1952, the summons came. 7 years. That is how long the Soviet system waited before it decided what to do with Helmut Becker. In 1952, he was brought before a Soviet military tribunal and charged with war crimes committed during his service on the Eastern Front. The charges were serious, and they were not without foundation. This is the part of the story where it becomes important to be honest about what the Totenkopf Division was and what it did. The formation Becker commanded within was responsible for documented atrocities, not allegations, not rumors, but verified acts of violence against prisoners of war and civilians that violated the laws of armed conflict by any standard. The massacre at Le Paradis was only the earliest and most well-known example. Across the Eastern Front, units within the division were involved in reprisals, executions, and conduct that left scars across every territory they passed through. Becker served within that system. He held authority within it. He rose through its ranks and accepted its rewards. Whatever the precise boundaries of his personal involvement, and historians continue to debate those boundaries, he cannot be separated from the institution he chose to serve. So the charges were not invented from nothing. There was a foundation of genuine accountability beneath them. But the process itself was something else entirely. Soviet military tribunals of this period were not designed to establish truth through adversarial examination. They were instruments of state power, and they operated accordingly. Defense counsel was limited, in many cases to a degree that made the concept of defense effectively meaningless. Evidence was presented on the prosecution's terms, and the outcomes in case after case appeared to have been determined before proceedings began. This was not a system built to ask whether a man was guilty. It was a system built to confirm that he was, and that is where the story becomes genuinely difficult, because two things can be true simultaneously. The Totenkopf Division committed atrocities that demanded accountability, and the Soviet tribunal that judged Helmut Becker was not a credible instrument of justice. These facts do not cancel each other out. They coexist, uncomfortably, unresolvably, and anyone who tries to collapse them into a simple narrative is not telling the full story. What is clear is that by 1952, Becker was no longer being judged purely as an individual. He was being judged as a symbol, a representative of a defeated system, as processed through the machinery of a rival system that had its own reasons for producing convictions. The Cold War was deepening. The Soviet Union had political motivations that extended far beyond the guilt or innocence of any single officer. Becker sat in that tribunal not as a commander, not as a soldier, not even as a prisoner in any conventional sense. He sat there as a man whose fate had been decided by forces entirely outside his control, forces that had been in motion long before he entered the room, and the verdict, when it came, surprised no one. The morning was quiet, no artillery, no engines, no shouted orders across a collapsing front line. Just the sound of footsteps on the stone as Helmut Becker was led from his cell for the last time. There was no audience, no ceremony, no final words recorded for history. The man who had commanded thousands, who had led armored divisions through the most devastating battles of the 20th century, who had earned every decoration his nation could offer, that man walked into a prison courtyard with nothing. No rank, no uniform, no army behind him. Just a verdict that had already been written and a sentence that had already been decided. And then it was over. A single bullet, quiet, controlled, absolute. The man the Eastern Front could not kill was finished in a moment that carried none of the drama the battlefield had provided for 6 years. No chaos, no heroism, no survival against the odds. Just an ending, administered efficiently, recorded bureaucratically, and filed away in a system that had no use for him beyond the statement his death could make. He was buried without ceremony, no marker, no recognition. The most decorated SS general the Totenkopf Division had produced simply ceased to exist, not in the fire of combat, but in the administrative silence of a Soviet prison facility. 7 years after the war that had defined him had already ended. And here is where the story resists the neat conclusion that narrative instinct demands. Because Helmut Becker was not one thing. He was a man of genuine military ability, calm, decisive, resilient beyond what most human beings could sustain. His capacity to lead under conditions that destroyed other men was real, documented, and undeniable. But he exercised that ability within a system that produced immense human suffering. He commanded within a division built from concentration camp guards. He rose through an organization whose ideology was inseparable from its crimes. And he accepted every honor that system bestowed upon him without, so far as the historical record shows, meaningful reservation. He was then judged by another system, one that claimed moral authority over the first but operated with methods that bore uncomfortable similarities. The Soviet structure that executed him demanded obedience, punished dissent, and justified its actions in the name of a cause it placed above individual lives. The tribunal that condemned him was not built to find truth. It was built to produce outcomes. Two systems of power, both claiming righteousness, both capable of extraordinary violence, and Helmut Becker, caught between them, destroyed by the second after serving the first. Was his execution justice? And there are grounds to argue that it was. That a man who held authority within the Totenkopf bore responsibility for what the Totenkopf did. Was it political? There are equally strong grounds to argue that as well, that his death served Soviet interests more than it served accountability. The honest answer is that history does not always separate the two. Helmut Becker survived the war. He did not survive its consequences, and his story, uncomfortable, unresolved, resistant to easy judgment, remains exactly what history so often is when you look at it closely enough. A question that does not come with a clean answer.